The Grand Millennium Hall in Beijing was a suffocating masterpiece of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the distinct humid hum of excessive wealth gathered in a single air-conditioned space. For Eleanor Vance, a woman who had built her fortune in the steel canyons of Chicago and the high-speed trading floors of New York, this gala was supposed to be a formality, a quiet observation of an investment she had nurtured from the shadows for years. She stood near a pillar of faux marble, swirling the deep crimson Cabernet in her glass, her presence intentionally understated in a simple, elegant black dress that cost more than most of the cars parked outside, though no one here would know it by looking. The room was a sea of bespoke suits and couture gowns, a cacophony of Mandarin and English chatter that signaled the impending merger of the Li family empire with a massive American conglomerate, a deal worth nearly $1 billion, orchestrated largely by her own capital. Li Wei, the young, charismatic CEO of the Li Group, was the center of gravity in the room, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man born into power, flanked by his parents, Chairman Li and Madame Li. They were traditionalists, people who measured worth by visible status and lineage, their smiles sharp and assessing as they greeted dignitaries and ignored the service staff. Elena watched them from her vantage point, her expression unreadable, calculating the final metrics of the deal in her head, until the crowd shifted unexpectedly, pushing a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes directly into her path. In a reflexive attempt to avoid the collision, she stepped back, her heel catching on the plush edge of the carpet, and the glass of red wine in her hand launched forward with disastrous precision. The crimson liquid arched through the air in slow motion, splashing violently against the pristine white lapel of Li Wei's bespoke Italian suit, the dark stain blooming instantly like a fresh wound on the fabric. The music seemed to stop, or perhaps the collective gasp of the 300 guests simply drowned it out, creating a vacuum of silence where only the sound of the empty glass hitting the floor resonated. Elena froze, her hand still outstretched, the horror of the clumsy accident washing over her not as a titan of industry, but merely as a guest who had committed an unforgivable social sin in a culture that prized face and perfection above all else. She stepped forward immediately, a napkin in hand, her voice steady but apologetic as she began to speak. "I'm so incredibly sorry, Mr. Li. Let me help you with—" Before she could finish, Madame Li stepped between them, her face twisted into a mask of scorn that transcended language barriers, though her words were in English for the benefit of the international guests. "Look what you have done," she hissed, her voice dripping with a venomous condescension that echoed off the high ceilings, drawing the eyes of every titan of industry in the room. "You clumsy woman. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? More than you will earn in a lifetime of whatever it is you do." The older woman's laughter was sharp, a performative sound meant to belittle, inviting the surrounding sycophants to join in the mockery of the outsider. Chairman Li joined his wife, chuckling as he inspected his son's ruined jacket, shaking his head with a dismissive wave of his hand that treated Eleanor like a nuisance, an insect to be shooed away from the feast. "This is why we must be careful who is allowed on the guest list," he announced loudly, his eyes scanning Elena's dark skin and understated attire with a look of profound arrogance. "Some people simply do not understand the grace required for high society. They are clumsy, foreign, and out of place." The laughter rippled through the inner circle, a jagged sound that tore at Elena's dignity, yet she did not shrink away, nor did she lower her eyes. Li Wei looked at the stain, then at Elena, his expression one of annoyance mixed with a flicker of something else, perhaps embarrassment at his parents' outburst, or perhaps just the irritation of a ruined photo opportunity. He dabbed at the wine with a silk handkerchief, not making eye contact with her, allowing his parents to construct the narrative of her inferiority without intervention. "It is fine," he muttered, though his tone suggested it was anything but. "Just, please step aside, madam. The cleaners will deal with the mess." He didn't ask her name, He didn't offer a reassurance. He simply dismissed her existence to salvage the moment for the cameras that were flashing in the distance. Elena straightened her spine, the apology dying on her lips as she processed the scene. The mocking laughter of the parents, the dismissal of the son, the collective judgment of a room that saw only a clumsy black woman, not the architect of their financial future. She felt the heat rise in her neck, not from shame, but from a cold, simmering fury that she had learned to channel into business strategy over 2 decades of fighting for her seat at the table. She looked at Chairman Lee, who was now turning his back to her to joke with a banker, and then at Madame Lee, who was signaling for security with a subtle flick of her wrist. "I offered to pay for the cleaning," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a steel resonance that went unnoticed by the chaotic group. "Pay?" Madame Lee laughed again, a sound like breaking glass. "You could not afford the thread this suit is sewn with. Go, before you embarrass yourself further. Enjoy the free champagne on your way out." The dismissal was absolute, a social execution performed in front of the global elite, designed to reinforce the hierarchy that the Lee family believed was unshakable. Eleanor took a slow breath, inhaling the scents of expensive perfume and old money, and made a mental note of the exact time. 8:42 p.m. She did not argue, nor did she cause a scene. She simply nodded once, a gesture of terrifying calmness that was misinterpreted as submission by everyone present. As she turned to walk away, navigating through the parting crowd that looked at her with pity or amusement, she reached into her small clutch and withdrew her phone. She didn't look back at the podium, where the Lee family was now recomposing themselves for the major announcement, the wine stain hidden behind a hastily rearranged stance. Her fingers moved across the screen with lethal precision, bypassing her assistant and logging directly into the secure portal of Vance Capital, the private equity firm that held the controlling interest in the Lee Group's bridge loans and the pending merger assets. The interface was stark, black and white, a contrast to the colorful opulence of the room she was leaving, and it displayed the numbers that governed the reality these people lived in. She found the contract ID for the merger, a deal structured to save the Lee family from a liquidity crisis they had desperately tried to hide. Elena paused near the heavy double doors of the ballroom, the sound of the chairman's voice booming over the microphone as he began his speech about prosperity, honor, and the future. She looked down at the execute button on her screen, a digital trigger that controlled $750 million and the fate of the family that had just laughed in her face. She didn't hesitate. She tapped the screen, authorized the command with her biometric ID, and slipped the phone back into her bag. The message would take exactly 30 seconds to route through the secure servers in New York and land with the weight of an anvil on the encrypted device in Li Wei's pocket. Elena pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool, smoggy night of Beijing, leaving the warmth of the gala behind, knowing that the temperature inside was about to drop to freezing. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere remained electric with celebration, the guests oblivious to the digital shockwave that was currently traversing the Pacific Ocean via fiber-optic cables. Li Wei stood beside his father, forcing a smile for the flashing cameras, though his mind was preoccupied with the logistics of the evening and the irritating sensation of wet fabric against his chest. He respected his parents, but he often found their old-world arrogance dangerous in a modern global economy, yet he had never corrected them, dependent as he was on their approval and the dynastic image they projected. He believed the merger was a done deal, a formality that would secure his legacy and wash away the debts incurred by his father's reckless real estate speculations in the provinces. Back in the quiet of the hotel garden, Eleanor sat on a stone bench, the city lights reflecting in a koi pond, her breathing steady as she replayed the interaction in her mind. It wasn't just the insult. She had endured racism and sexism before, in boardrooms from London to Tokyo, but this was different because of the leverage she held. She thought about her own parents, a nurse and a factory worker in Detroit who had taught her that dignity was not negotiable and that money was merely a tool to enforce respect when morality failed. She had bought into the Lee Group because the numbers made sense, because Li Wei showed promise, but she had a strict policy. She did not do business with people who dehumanized others. In the hall, the vibration in Li Wei's pocket was subtle, a single, sustained buzz that signaled a priority notification from the financial compliance officer, or so he thought. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his father's toast to eternal partnerships, but the phone buzzed again, then a third time, a relentless urgency that broke his concentration. He excused himself with a polite nod, stepping slightly back into the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain to check the screen, expecting a minor logistical hiccup or a congratulatory text from a stakeholder. When he unlocked the device, the screen was awash in red notifications, the logo of Vance Capital dominating the display with a clarity that made his stomach lurch. The message was brief, legally binding, and catastrophic. Notice of immediate withdrawal. Clause 14B, breach of conduct, loss of confidence. Li Wei frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen, his brain struggling to reconcile the festive atmosphere around him with the digital disaster unfolding in his hand. He scrolled down, confused, until he saw the signatory of the withdrawal, Elena Vance, managing partner. He froze, the name triggering a vague recognition from the mountains of due diligence documents he had skimmed months ago. The silent partner his lawyers had warned him never to cross. The American entity that provided the liquidity for the entire operation. He looked up, scanning the room frantically, his eyes searching for the woman his mother had just evicted, the clumsy foreigner who had spilled the wine. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman in the black dress was not a random guest or a +1. She was the architect of his survival. Across the room, Chairman Lee was raising his glass, gesturing for his son to join him for the final announcement of the merger, oblivious to the fact that the floor had just been removed from under them. "Come, Li Wei!" the old man bellowed jovially. "Come tell our friends about the future!" The crowd applauded, a sound that now sounded to Li Wei like the distant thunder of an approaching storm. He looked at his parents, seeing them suddenly not as titans, but as liabilities, their arrogance a ticking bomb that had finally exploded. Li Wei frantically dialed the number attached to the email, praying for an answer, but it went straight to voicemail. A cool, professional recording of an American woman's voice that matched the tone of the woman who had apologized to him minutes earlier. He listened to the recording. "You have reached the private office of Elena Vance. Leave a message," and the connection clicked off. The finality of the tone sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the wine soaking his shirt. He looked at the crowd, at the waiting investors, at the representatives of the American conglomerate who were smiling, expecting a signature. If he proceeded with the announcement, he would be committing fraud. Without the Vance Capital, the merger was mathematically impossible, and the Lee Group was effectively insolvent. He was trapped between the crushing weight of public humiliation and the legal reality of corporate suicide. His mother, Madame Lee, approached him, whispering harshly, "Put that phone away, you look distracted. The cameras are on you. Smile." She adjusted his tie, oblivious to the fact that she had just insulted the only person capable of saving them. "That woman ruined your suit. Do not let her ruin your mood," she added, unaware that she was digging their grave with every word. Li Wei looked at his mother, really looked at her, seeing the pettiness etched into her expensive makeup, and for the first time he felt a surge of resentment towards the bubble of privilege they lived in. "It wasn't the suit, Mother," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It was the bank." She looked at him with confusion, unable to pass the sentence, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He stepped away from her, walking slowly toward the microphone, his legs feeling heavy, like he was moving through water. The room quieted down, anticipating the speech that would seal the deal, the climax of the evening. Li Wei gripped the podium, his knuckles white, the silence of the room amplifying the pounding of his heart. He saw the faces of the board members, the eager journalists, the competitors waiting for a slip-up. He knew that whatever he said next would define the rest of his life. He looked at the phone one last time, seeing the terminated status blinking in cruel red pixels. There was no way out, no spin that could fix this, no negotiation that could undo the insult to a woman like Elena Vance. The silence in the Grand Millennium Hall was absolute, a heavy, expectant hush that usually precedes a moment of triumph. But to Li Wei, it felt like the breathless quiet before an execution. He stood at the podium, the microphone picking up the shallow intake of his breath, amplifying it to the hundreds of guests who watched him with gleaming eyes. His father stood a few feet away, beaming with pride, holding a crystal flute of champagne, completely unaware that the empire he thought he was handing down had just evaporated into the digital ether. Li Wei looked out into the crowd and saw the exit doors where Eleanor had vanished. The space she left behind felt massive, a black hole swallowing the room's light. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and grating over the speakers. "My parents," he began, his voice wavering before he caught himself, steeling his resolve. "My parents taught me that business is about strength, about projecting power." He glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly, thinking this was the preamble to a victory speech. "But they forgot to teach me that the true currency of global business is respect." The confusion rippled through the front row. This was not the script. Chairman Li's smile faltered, his eyebrows knitting together in irritation. He took a half-step forward as if to intervene, to steer his son back to the prepared remarks about synergy and growth. But Li Wei raised a hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that froze his father in place. "Tonight, we insulted a guest," Li Wei continued, his voice gaining strength, driven by the adrenaline of disaster. "We judged a book by its cover, and we laughed at someone we deemed beneath us." "What is he doing?" Madame Li hissed audibly, her face flushing with anger. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a nervous energy spreading like wildfire. The representatives from the American conglomerate exchanged worried glances, sensing the instability radiating from the stage. Li Wei ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the red tally light of the recording camera at the back of the room. "That guest," Li Wei said, speaking directly to the lens, hoping Elena was watching the live stream somewhere, "was Elena Vance, the majority investor of the Li Group, the silent partner who made this night possible." The name dropped like a bomb. A collective gasp went through the room as the realization hit the financial journalists and the bankers who knew the name well. Chairman Li's face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as he comprehended the magnitude of his wife's error. Li Wei looked down at his phone, which he had placed on the podium. The screen was still dark, no reprieve, no message of forgiveness. He knew what he had to do. He had to align himself with the reality of the situation, not the fantasy his parents lived in. He had to be the executioner of his own dreams to save any shred of his integrity. He looked up, his eyes dead, and delivered the sentence. "Effective immediately," Li Wei said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I must announce that due to a withdrawal of capital support, we must terminate the 750 million merger." The words hung in the air, 5 distinct nails in the coffin of the evening. Terminate the 750 million merger. For a second, there was no reaction, as if the audience couldn't process the linguistic impossibility of the statement. Then chaos. The room erupted, shouted questions, the crash of a glass dropped by a shocked waiter, the frantic typing of reporters rushing to break the story. The stock price of the Li Group, trading on the after-hours markets, began to plummet instantly as the algorithm bots picked up the keywords terminate and merger. Chairman Li staggered back, clutching his chest, the shock physically overwhelming him. "You are mad!" he screamed at his son, forgetting the microphone was still live. "You are destroying us! For what? For a spilled drink?" The desperation in his voice was pathetic, stripping away the veneer of the untouchable patriarch. Madame Li stood frozen, her mouth open, the humiliation she had inflicted on Elena now reflecting back on her 1,000 times over. Li Wei did not look at his father. "It was never about the drink, father," he said into the mic, his voice cutting through the noise. "It costs nothing to be kind, but arrogance has cost us everything." He stepped back from the podium, signaling the end of the event and perhaps the end of the Li family's dominance in Beijing. Security guards rushed to the stage, unsure who to protect or who to remove. The American partners were already on their phones, barking orders to their legal teams to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The gala, moments ago a symbol of supreme success, had transformed into a scene of panic and ruin. Li Wei walked off the stage, walking past his sobbing mother and his raging father. He felt a strange lightness, the lifting of a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. He had lost the deal, lost the money, and likely lost his position, but he had reclaimed the truth. He walked straight toward the exit, loosening his wine-stained tie, stepping out into the night where Elena had gone, leaving the wreckage behind him. The fallout was swift, brutal, and global. By the time the sun rose over New York, the story had dominated the financial news cycles, not just as a business failure, but as a morality play. "The wine stain that wiped out an empire" was the headline on the Wall Street Journal. The footage of Li Wei's speech went viral, accumulating millions of views, with commentators dissecting the arrogance of the parents and the stunning revelation of Elena Vance's identity. In the high-stakes world of private equity, Elena's reputation soared. She was seen as a woman of absolute principle, a terrifying force who could not be bought or bullied. In Beijing, the Li family estate was under siege by creditors and reporters. The cancellation of the merger triggered default clauses on loans that had been leveraged against the deal. The empire that Chairman Li had boasted about was revealed to be a house of cards, held together by the very capital Elena had withdrawn. Without her backing, the banks circled like sharks. Chairman Li was forced to resign in disgrace within 48 hours, citing health reasons, though everyone knew the truth. He had laughed away his legacy. Madame Li, once the queen of Beijing society, found herself a pariah. The invitations to galas stopped coming. Her friends stopped returning her calls. The shame of being the catalyst for the family's ruin was a heavy cloak she wore in the silence of their downsizing mansion. She was haunted by the memory of her own laughter, realizing too late that the foreign woman she had mocked held the keys to the kingdom she had lost. Li Wei remained in the eye of the storm, managing the liquidation of assets to pay off debts. He worked from a small, rented office, stripped of the luxuries he had known since birth. Surprisingly, he found he did not miss them. He was exhausted, his phone ringing constantly with angry shareholders, but he managed the collapse with a dignity that earned him a grudging respect from the business community. He didn't blame Elena. In fact, he admired the ruthlessness of the lesson. Across the ocean, in her penthouse office in Chicago, Elena watched the stock ticker with a stoic expression. Her team had already reallocated the funds into a renewable energy project in Brazil. Money never sleeps, and neither did she. She felt no joy in the destruction of the Li family, only the satisfaction of a necessary correction. She had received a handwritten letter from Li Wei, sent via courier, apologizing not for the loss of money, but for the loss of honor. She had read it twice, then filed it away. The impact on the market was tangible. Other firms began to hastily review their diversity policies and their treatment of silent partners. The story became a case study in business schools. The Vance Correction. It taught a generation of young executives that in a globalized world, you never know who is holding the other end of the leash. One rainy afternoon in Chicago, Elena received a request for a meeting. It was Li Wei. He had flown to the United States commercial class to meet her. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for the deal back. He was asking for 15 minutes of her time. Elena looked at her schedule, packed with meetings worth millions, and considered declining. But she remembered the moment he had stood on stage and told the truth. "Let him up," she told her assistant. She turned her chair to face the window, watching the rain streak against the glass, reflecting the grey steel of the city. She was curious to see what remained of the man after the fire had burned everything away. When Li Wei entered her office, he looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary humility. He wore a simple suit, off the rack, and carried no entourage. He stood at the door, waiting for her to invite him in, a stark contrast to the boy who had let his mother fight his battles. "Ms. Vance," he said, bowing slightly, a gesture of genuine respect this time. "Thank you for seeing me." Elena turned her chair slowly, her face composed. She didn't offer him a drink. She simply gestured to the chair opposite her desk. The dynamic had shifted completely. The power was now visible, tangible, and undisputed. The office was silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Li Wei sat on the edge of the leather chair, his hands clasped on his lap, looking nothing like the princeling of Beijing. Elena observed him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, testing his resolve. She saw the fatigue in his eyes, the lines of stress that hadn't been there a week ago, but she also saw a steadiness that had been absent at the gala. "I didn't come here to beg," Li Wei said quietly, breaking the silence. "The company is being broken up. My father is retired. The debts are being settled." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I came to return this." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check. It was a cashier's check for an amount that represented the personal liquidation of his own assets. His apartment, his car, his watch collection. It was a fraction of the $750 million, a mere drop in the ocean, but it was significant. "What is this?" Elena asked, her voice cool, betraying no emotion. She didn't reach for the paper. "It covers the penalty fees for the contract breach," Li Wei explained. "It is not what the company owes you. The lawyers are handling that. This is what I owe you, personally." He pushed the check across the mahogany desk. "My parents, they will never understand. They live in a world that no longer exists, but I want to understand. I want to start over." Eleanor looked at the check. It was a gesture of atonement, a desperate attempt to salvage his own name from the wreckage his family had created. She picked it up, examining the numbers. It was everything he had. She looked back at him. "You think this buys forgiveness, Li Wei?" "No," he answered immediately. "It buys freedom. I don't want to owe you. I don't want to be the man who stood by while you were insulted." He met her gaze, his eyes clear. "You taught me a lesson that cost $1 billion. It was an expensive education, but I learned it." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. She ripped the check in half. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Li Wei flinched, confused. She dropped the pieces into the waste bin. "I don't need your money, Li Wei. I need competent partners, and right now you are toxic." Li Wei nodded, accepting the judgment. He stood up to leave, looking defeated but resigned. He had tried. "I understand. Goodbye, Ms. Vance." "Sit down," Elena commanded. The authority in her voice froze him. He hesitated, then slowly sank back into the chair. Elena leaned forward, clasping her hands on the desk. "You destroyed your own company to tell the truth. That is rare. Stupid, financially speaking, but rare." She opened a folder on her desk. "I have a distressed asset in Southeast Asia, a logistics firm. It's a mess. Bad management, corruption, debt. It needs someone who understands how to dismantle arrogance and build structure. It pays a fraction of what you used to make. You will be an employee, not a CEO. You will report to a regional manager who reports to me." Li Wei stared at her, processing the offer. It was a demotion, a humiliation by his old standards, but a lifeline in his new reality. It was a chance to work, a chance to rebuild, brick by brick, without the shadow of his parents looming over him. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you know the cost of a stain," Elena said, her eyes hard and bright, "and because you were the only person in that room who didn't laugh." She closed the folder and pushed it toward him. "You start Monday. Don't make me regret it." Li Wei took the folder, holding it like a lifeline. He stood up, bowed deeply, not the shallow bow of social obligation, but the deep bow of profound gratitude, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. "Miss Vance?" "Yes?" "The wine," he said, a small, genuine smile appearing on his face for the first time. "It was a Cabernet, wasn't it? Good vintage." 2015, Elena replied, turning back to her screens. "Don't spill it next time." Li Wei walked out of the office, leaving the opulent world of his parents behind forever, stepping into a harder, colder, but infinitely more real world. Elena watched him go, then picked up her phone to call her broker. The lesson was over. Business continued, and in the reflection of the glass she adjusted her collar. The silent partner, who had spoken loud enough for the whole world to hear,